The torches cast long, trembling shadows over the marble floor as Flavia walked forward barefoot, each step carrying her farther from the girl she had once been and closer to a destiny she had never chosen. Her breath quivered in her chest. She couldn't tell if it was the cold seeping up from the stone or the invisible weight that had been pressing on her lungs since sunset. Behind her, 7 witnesses stood perfectly still, silhouettes carved by the half-light of the lamps. Their faces showed neither kindness nor cruelty, just the calm detachment of people accustomed to observing rituals no one dared name aloud. They told her this was tradition, that every bride in Rome had taken those same steps, that resisting would only bring shame upon her family. But no one had ever explained what the rite actually was. Not until now. Now that the veil of the public ceremony had fallen away and only the bare reality remained. When they pulled back the cloth that hid the figure in the corner, Flavia understood that Roman marriage had nothing to do with the cheerful images of saffron veils, walnuts, and blessings displayed during the procession. Those were just the decorations, the polite surface layer, bright paint covering something far older and far more unsettling. It was the year 89 of our era, under the rule of Emperor Domitian. Flavia, barely 18, stood on the edge of a threshold that would change not only her legal status, but the way she understood her own body. The day had begun with familiar rituals, the orange veil marking her as a wife, the 6 braids tied with woolen ribbons, the auspices pronounced favorable after the sacrificial reading, the contract transferring her from her father's authority into the hands of Marcus Petronius Rufus, a grain merchant 25 years older than she was, a man she had met only 3 times. All of that, strange as it had felt, was still recognizable. It was public, safe to mention, the part of the wedding that didn't give anyone chills. But what waited behind the closed door at the end of the torchlit path belonged to another world entirely. A world where tradition stopped being symbolic and became a tool. A world where the bride's body ceased to be her own and turned into the central object of a legal transaction. It was there, in that sealed chamber full of witnesses and silence, that the real transformation occurred. Centuries later, historians would still struggle with the contradiction. How could a civilization capable of building aqueducts, libraries, and legal systems so precise also create rituals that now seem almost unimaginable? Yet on that night, Flavia wasn't thinking about philosophy or history. She only felt a faint whisper inside her, like a crack forming, widening. Something inside her was about to break, and she suspected it would never fully heal. The bridal procession earlier that day had looked like something from the frescoes decorating Roman villas. Flavia walked across the cobblestone streets, her flame-colored veil catching the sunlight like a small fire. It was a symbol so ancient that no one remembered its original meaning. Around her, neighbors sang festive verses meant to provoke laughter, though in truth they were so explicit they made her cheeks burn beneath the cloth. They were the traditional Fescennine songs, crude, mocking, supposedly used to chase away bad omens, but more often turning into public teasing disguised as good wishes. Her mother walked beside her with a solemnity that clashed with the forced cheer of the crowd. That morning, as she braided Flavia's hair, a few tears had slipped down her cheeks. They weren't nostalgic tears. They came from somewhere deeper, from something she herself had never managed to put into words. Before Flavia joined the procession, her mother had embraced her tightly, tighter than ever before. With a voice barely louder than a breath, she whispered, "Do not resist. Whatever happens tonight, do not resist." Only that will keep things from becoming worse. The words settled into Flavia's mind like a dark omen. As the procession moved forward, young men tossed walnuts at her feet, a gesture meant to symbolize fertility and abundance. But as the shells bounced against her dress, slipping between its folds, Flavia felt less blessed and more exposed, as if the ritual itself were mocking her. Some men shouted comments that made her shrink even further beneath her veil. She was expected to laugh. Laughter, they said, carried ritual power. But when she glanced toward her mother, she saw no smile, only the reflection of an old, inherited pain, passed down like a secret no woman was allowed to speak aloud. The streets narrowed as they approached the home of Marcus Petronius Rufus. 2 torches burned beside the entrance, announcing that this was the place where the union would be completed, according to the law. The doorway, decorated with wool and greenery, marked a symbolic crossing, from a father's protection to a husband's authority, from girlhood to adult obedience. Marcus waited at the threshold. He lifted her in his arms to carry her across it. A tradition repeated long after people forgot. It was meant to imitate a woman being taken by force. When the door closed behind them, the noise of the street faded, but the silence inside the house didn't bring comfort. It was a silence filled with watching eyes, footsteps shifting in the shadows, breaths belonging not to a newlywed couple but to a group of witnesses summoned to observe, record, and if needed, testify. There were too many figures in the dim light for this to be called a private moment. Her mother's warning echoed louder in her mind, pushing through the growing dread. For the first time that night, Flavia understood that everything before this moment had been only a preamble. The decisive part, the one that would define her place in the marriage and in Roman society, was about to begin. As her eyes adjusted to the soft glow of the atrium, she realized she had left behind not just the street, but any illusion of privacy. Every object in the room had a purpose. Every person watching her was part of a mechanism carefully constructed to legitimize what was about to happen. To her right stood the pronuba, the woman responsible for guiding brides through the rites. She wore solemn robes and stood perfectly still, as if she had spent her entire life witnessing identical scenes. Beside her, a priest muttered prayers. Whether ancient or adapted, Flavia couldn't tell, murmuring words that placed divine responsibility over a ritual created entirely by society. In one corner, 3 enslaved women waited with jars of perfumed water and clean cloths, their eyes lowered, accustomed to seeing everything while being noticed by no one. Against the wall sat an older man with a leather bag full of medical instruments. His presence was not a detail. It represented the legal dimension of marriage. He was not there to comfort her. He was there to verify, to document, to certify with the cold detachment of a scribe whatever the law considered essential. But the object that drew Flavia's eyes the most was the structure covered by a heavy cloth in the far corner of the atrium. Its shape was irregular, its height reaching a man's chest. She didn't know what lay beneath it, but her intuition screamed that this was the heart of the ritual, the part no one dared describe openly. Everything in the room, from the smell of incense to the arrangement of the witnesses, pointed toward that silent figure. The pronuba stepped forward and took Flavia's hands with firm certainty. Not cruel, not tender, just absolute. "Welcome to your husband's household," she declared, her voice carrying ritual authority. "From this moment forward, the sacred rites must be completed, as tradition demands." Flavia swallowed hard. She knew in theory that Roman marriage wasn't romantic. It was a contract. Her father had told her many times, "Conventio in manum," the legal passage that made her part of her husband's family, like an item entering an inventory. The dowry, the witnesses, the contract signatures, everything had been treated as a transaction. But she had never imagined this sense of transfer would extend to her physical presence, to every gesture she was expected to make tonight. The Pranuba continued speaking, reciting history and protocol with the ease of someone who had memorized it since childhood. The Pranuba continued speaking, weaving together custom and law as if reciting a familiar lesson. She explained that just as a field had to be inspected before being sold, just as a ship needed to be examined before changing owners, marriage too required verification. Her tone was calm, practical. There was no hint of malice in her words, only the quiet conviction of someone who believed that this was simply how the world worked. In that moment, Flavia felt as if she had stepped into a vast machine built long before she was born. A machine that did not distinguish between land, livestock, or human bodies. For the law, everything could be measured, evaluated, transferred. And as she looked at the still faces of the witnesses, she understood that the ritual was not really for her. She was not the audience. She was the object. The Pranuba gestured toward the covered structure in the corner. That small movement made the air grow heavy. Something tightened in Flavia's chest, as though her breath itself was tied to whatever lay hidden under the cloth. Guided by the woman's firm hand, she walked forward. The witnesses lowered their heads slightly, not in reverence, but in a weary acknowledgement of what was to come. To them, this was just another repetition of an ancient script, a rite so old that no one thought to question it. Flavia reached for the edge of the cloth. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it aside. The atrium seemed to fall into complete silence. Before her stood a wooden figure, upright and polished, carved with deliberate care. It wasn't small enough to wear as an amulet, nor decorative like the statues in patrician gardens. It was larger, unmistakable in its purpose, impossible to ignore. The message of its shape, its exaggerated features, was brutally clear. "You must greet Mutinus Tutinus," the Pranuba said, her voice now shifting into something almost reverent. "You must ask for his blessing to receive your husband and present yourself to him as tradition commands." Flavia had heard the name before, in fragments, in half-whispered conversations between older women, always followed by an abrupt silence or a quick, "That is not spoken of in front of girls." Mutinus Tutinus, the god of conjugal beginnings and fertility. A god so uncomfortable for the Romans that he was rarely shown in public spaces. Yet, despite that discomfort, ancient writers, pagan and later Christian, had mentioned him. They almost never went into detail, but the tone of their words betrayed unease. To speak of him too clearly would be to expose something that society preferred to keep shrouded. Centuries later, St. Augustine would write about this rite with fury, calling it an obscenity unworthy even of description. Arnobius would hint that brides were brought before the symbol of the god under the watchful eyes of their husbands. Varro, a pagan scholar who wasn't trying to shock anyone, would describe the presentation and contact in vague but unmistakable terms. Every author avoided details, and precisely that silence, those evasions, made the reality more revealing than any explicit explanation. Modern interpretations sometimes try to soften it, insisting that the gesture was merely symbolic, a brief sitting on the god's lap, a harmless touch, a quaint, embarrassing custom, nothing mas. But the language of the ancient sources doesn't always support that comforting version. They spoke of surrender, of initiation, of submission. They didn't describe the act plainly, But the weight of what they didn't say was heavier than any direct description. For the Romans, Mutinus Tutinus represented the power to open the path to married life. For Christian writers centuries later, he would become a symbol of Rome's moral decay, the proof of a world that blurred the line between sacred and practical. But for Flavia, in that moment, he wasn't an idea, a theological debate, or a historical curiosity. He was a presence. He was the carved, unyielding shape standing in front of her, and she was being told to approach him, to expose herself before him, to let her body become the stage on which a god and a contract met. The Pronuba adjusted Flavia's shoulders with careful precision, as if positioning an object within a fixed ritual. Around them, the witnesses kept their eyes lowered, not because modesty demanded it, but because their role did not include emotion, only confirmation. The priest fell silent. The physician watched from the edge of the atrium, his attention sharp and professional. Marcus, at the back of the room, looked on with obvious nervousness, as though he too were trapped in a role he hadn't written. In that instant, Flavia realized the rite had nothing to do with divine favor. It was a mechanism, a gate built by tradition, a way of teaching her from the very beginning that her will mattered less than the steps of the ritual, less than the law, less than the expectations of those watching. Standing before Mutinus Tutinus, she understood that the night had barely begun. The murmur of the lamps grew deafening. The Pronuba placed Flavia directly in front of the wooden figure. No one needed to describe what came next. The ritual itself contained its own instructions. Still, the older woman spoke in a soft, almost motherly tone, giving precise directions. That gentleness made everything worse. Flavia's body trembled. She couldn't name the feeling completely. Fear, yes. Shame, yes. But also the slow, suffocating awareness that her own desires no longer counted. The Pronuba's hands were firm as she guided each movement, correcting anything that might resemble hesitation. There was no overt violence, no shouting, just a steady, unbreakable insistence. This had to be done. Tradition did not accept deviations. The witnesses remained at their posts. Their expressions didn't change. To them, this was as ordinary as sealing a contract. Their presence turned Flavia into proof, into evidence of compliance.